In this lesson, we'll learn how to eliminate noise and other artifacts that may begin to appear within our renders. Okay, so go ahead and open up the project file for this lesson, and you'll find kind of where we left off in the previous lesson. So now, in the previous lesson, we actually worked on sort of setting this scene up from scratch, creating the lights, applying the decay rate to the lights, and making sure everything was scaled up appropriately. So we ended up with sort of a render that looked pretty much like this. And I pointed out to you kind of at the end of the last lesson that while we do have really good illumination in a lot of these areas, you can see in some of these areas where we have some sort of excessive noise and artifacts that are really beginning to show up inside of our render. Now, I want to go ahead and just take a few moments to sort of address these and talk a little bit about how we can begin to fix this type of noise. So now, in looking at this noise, let's go ahead and jump over here to our render settings. We'll go ahead and tap on that button right there. And once we're inside the Mental Ray render settings, let's come over to the Quality tab here. Now, under the Quality tab, if we look under Sampling, what you should see if you're using Maya 2014 or later is the sampling mode of Unified Sampling should be your default. Now, prior to Maya 2014, there was a little bit different setup under sampling here, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. But basically, with Maya 2014 and on, we have access to unified sampling, and you can see by default, the quality setting is set to 0.25. So now when it comes to really the overall quality of this image, we can quickly and easily begin to adjust that by either turning down our quality setting here or driving it up. And you can see here we can drive that all the way up, again, as high as 2.0, but this is a setting that we could overdrive if we really wanted to. You can see here I've set that to 5, but I would not recommend doing that. Let's go ahead and bump that back to 0.25, and as a matter of fact, that's what I currently have this particular render set at right here. That was set at 0.25 when I took that render. So let me just bump this down to something smaller, maybe 0.1. We'll go ahead and close out of this, and let's go ahead and re-render this here and take a look at those same noise and artifacts that showed up a moment ago. All right, great. So when we zoom in now, what we should see is those noise and artifacts are a bit worse. Let me come in here and save this for comparison, and I'll bump this up back to 0.25 just so we can do a little back and forth here and kind of begin to do a little comparing of the artifacts that are showing up at the different quality settings here within Mental Ray. So again, this render was taken at 0.25 quality, and if we come in here and begin to compare that, it's pretty easy to see that at 0.25 the noise is a little bit better, but again, we're still looking at quite a bit of noise here. So what we could do is we could continue to drive this up. Let's go ahead and bump this up to something pretty significant here. Maybe we set this up to a value of 1. All right, we'll go ahead and close out of our render settings again. Now notice what happened when we bumped it up from really a 0.1 to a 0.25. We went from an 8-second render to a 10-second render, so it did affect our render times. Let's go ahead and now re-render this with a value of 1 for the quality. Now when that render wraps up, let's go ahead and take a look. First thing you should notice here that we added another 8 seconds to my render time. But again, if we look at this shadow that our robot is casting on the ground here at the quality rate of 1, you can see it here. And then if we jump down to 0.25, again, you can see a slight increase in the quality and a decrease in the amount of noise and artifacts that we're seeing here. So now, prior to Maya 2014, as I mentioned, there was a little bit different setup. Let me go ahead and show you what that looks like here. I'm going to go ahead and save this render for comparison here, just so we can have all those saved. And what we can actually do is we can change the sampling mode here from Unified Sampling, which it currently is, down to this Legacy Sampling mode. Now, that's going to change pretty much everything in the sampling rollout here. So basically, with Legacy Sampling mode selected, what we can do here is we can begin to, depending on the sampling mode that we choose below that, we can begin to adjust, say, the max sample level. Right now I'm set at 0, which you can see here the number of samples. It's going to sample at least once per 16 pixels and at most once per pixel. Well, that doesn't seem like a whole lot. Let's go ahead and render that out and just take a look. And when you can see here when our render comes back, obviously the render occurred much quicker, but we have a definite decrease in quality here. And the noise and artifacts is very noticeable with this particular max sample level set. So let's bump that up a few. Let's go ahead and bump that up to maybe 3. And you can see at a max level of 3, we're sampling at least 4 samples per pixel, and at most 64 samples per pixel. That's pretty significant. Let's go ahead and jump back over to our render view and save for comparison. And go ahead and set off another render here. Alright, great. Now when this render comes back, you're going to see a pretty significant change here when we look at this shadow. You can see here, this was before, and this is after. Now again, we've added a pretty significant chunk of time to our render here. We went from a render time of 6 seconds up to a render time of 21 seconds. So, and if you look here, you can still see some noise that is starting to occur in the shadow. So with this older sampling mode, this legacy sampling mode, typically it was pretty difficult just here inside the render settings to get rid of any kind of these noise and artifacts that we're seeing here. Now let me show you kind of what you had to pair with these settings in order to begin to fix that with older versions of Maya. I'm going to close out of the render settings and the render view for right now. And let me just come in here and select my light right over here. I'm going to open up my attribute editor by hitting Control A, and let's scroll down in the attributes here and let's look at the shadows for this particular light. Now if we scroll down, you can see here that by default the Use Ray Trace Shadows option was turned on, but what we have here is a Shadow Rays attribute that we can begin to change. By default, it's set at 1. So with older versions of Maya, what you would kind of have to do is you would have to adjust your sampling rate, your max samples in your render settings, and then you would need to come into each and every light source for your shadows and maybe bump up your number of shadow rays so that you could begin to increase the quality. So if we come over here and do that for both of these two lights, we'll just set them up to a value of 10 here. And at this point, if we came back in and saved for comparison and re-rendered, what we'll notice if we go ahead and zoom in on our render is once we have bumped up the number of shadow rays, we're now seeing a pretty significant improvement in at least the sampling of our shadows. Now, this is something that would have to be done on every light inside your scene. And if you had things like glossy samples within your materials that you were using, you would also have to bump those up so that you would eliminate any kind of noise or artifacts inside of those. Now, let me just go ahead and go back over to my unified sampling really quickly here. We'll just come back in and switch that to unified sampling. Now, as we saw with some previous renders here, if we kind of scroll back here and begin to look, I believe this was our last one at a quality setting of 1. You can see there is still some noise here. So there's a couple of ways that we can go about fixing this. There's a wrong way and there's a right way. So the wrong way to fix this would be to continue driving this quality setting up. Right now I have this set at 1, and I very rarely, if ever, would increase this over 1 to maybe 1.5. Beyond that, you are allocating more samples to the entire render that are really not needed. You're increasing your render times when you really don't need to. When really you've got a very specific problem here. In this case, it's noise and artifacts inside this shadow that can be fixed, again, by jumping over to our attribute editor inside of our light and beginning to bump up our shadow rays. So we can come in and increase the number of shadow rays regardless of which sampling mode that we're using.